What a horrible night to have a curse. That sentence has taken on a life of its own, and its presence in Castlevania II: Simon's Quest encapsulates so much of what revisiting this game means. You see the text constantly thanks to the fact that it's not just a random piece of dialogue, but a mandatory bumper between you and every day-night cycle. Its very existence awkwardly interrupts whatever you're doing with slow-crawling, unstoppable text, and the weird translation of that text implies that there might be a good night to have a curse. To be an English speaker playing an English copy of Simon's Quest is to be engaging with a game that's just a little bit off. In any other setting or tone, that would be easy to write off as an unambiguous downside, but the way that poor translation obfuscates your objectives adds this extra level of futility to your first hour of play. The moody atmosphere, the connection to curses, and the doomsday clock hanging over you getting the good ending all make the unintentionally bad translation feel like meaningful texture. There's a surreal aimlessness that comes with playing. It's like a creepypasta, as if the game came in a shoddy-looking cartridge and was given to you by a man who just looks off in ways you can't explain. Playing it may not be smooth, but it's absolutely worthwhile. Castlevania II: Simon's Quest is famously obtuse and hugely controversial. It's a Metroidvania before we had the term, and its bad localization ensures that its cryptic puzzles become downright unsolvable without a guide. What were supposed to be specific hints and detailed instructions get translated into flavor text that doesn't inform you of much of anything. Even if they were decipherable, you have this extra in-universe layer of confusion thanks to some of the NPCs being tricksters who are trying to confuse you. It's so arcane that the frustration of playing it blind spawned the first episode of The Angry Video Game Nerd, creating a legacy of video game reviews arguably larger than the legacy of the game itself. But the law of the internet states that the greater the criticism a game receives, the greater the flowers it will get in the future. And I think Simon's Quest is owed some. Am I just an annoying contrarian? Are my expectations just subconsciously lowered from decades of this game being lampooned? Maybe. It's more than likely my willingness to use a guide for this one when I got stuck. Just pretend GameFAQs is issue 2 of Nintendo Power with a full game walkthrough, and all of a sudden the adventure latent within Castlevania II can become realized. In my review covering the first game, I likened that original to a hero's journey. That's only because I hadn't played Simon's Quest yet. The themes of pious weapons helping us triumph over evil are amplified, and they're spaced out a bit more too. What were previously temporary power-ups or consumables are now permanent upgrades in order to fit the game's new format. Castlevania I was made for home consoles, but like many early NES games, it was built in the arcade tradition. Simon's Quest took advantage of the new playstyles that home consoles allowed, multi-hour long-term play. It's more akin to what would eventually become the series' namesake. It's a Metroidvania, and a superb one at that. If the thrill of Castlevania 1 is beating Dracula, then the thrill of Castlevania 2 is preparing to beat Dracula, and you can see that clearly within moments of starting each game. 1 opens with Simon marching to the gates of the ominous titular Castlevania. 2 opens with Simon being unceremoniously dropped into a village with no scary castle in sight. You have to ask around and fumble through poorly translated dialogue to identify that Dracula must be summoned before he can be slain, involving the collection of his body parts scattered across different manors of the realm. There's a compelling fantasy here, one of escalating power allowing you to take on stronger enemies, stronger castles, and finding secrets. There's more work involved tapping into that fantasy though. What do I do is a question that you'll have to ask yourself constantly while playing. It's obtuse. Famously, it's holding particular items in particular areas while kneeling for 5 seconds levels of obtuse. On my first blind attempt, I tried the old reliable NES strategy of walking to the right, platforming my way eastward through what would have been like 2.5 original Castlevania levels worth of zombies over the course of about 20 minutes. Then I was met with a dead end, needing a piece to a puzzle I didn't even realize I was supposed to be solving. Rolling credits on this one demands reevaluating your approach. Getting enjoyment out of this adventure is contingent upon recognizing that complementary materials are part of the experience. Heroes accept outside help all the time, right? Once you get over those initial pathfinding hurdles, or use a guide to circumvent them, it's a breezier game than you'd expect. The difficulty of exploration wasn't added but shifted. The combat here is noticeably easier. Enemies are seldom blocking major choke points or crowded around stairs like they are in Castlevania 1, and you can even mitigate their damage by only fighting them during the day, thanks to the game's day-night cycles. If you do die, you respawn on the last safe platform, and you can do so as much as you want thanks to unlimited continues. If there's a major non-translation related downside to Simon's Quest, it would probably be the lack of authored, challenging encounters. The wider surface area of this game means less time was spent crafting each piece. There's not just a singular castle to flesh out, but multiple towns, multiple dungeons, and the many multiple pathways connecting them. Take a random snapshot of any given playthrough, and you'll probably be on a samey looking straight road, fighting haphazardly placed enemies. There's nothing that even remotely resembles the iconic hallway leading to death from the first game. Even the dungeons are kind of plain. You get in, do some basic platforming, get your Dracula body part, and then exfiltrate in no less than like 10 minutes. Usually there's no boss either, and if there is, it's probably exploitably easy. Castlevania II is not a game of moments or set pieces. There's wheat for that chaff though. Simon's Quest isn't just larger but more featured. RPGs were clearly a huge influence. The towns have merchants and churches, within which you can heal. That genre bending can be felt the most when it comes to character progression. It's Simon who's supposed to be getting stronger, not you. You can grind for levels, you can grind for currency, and you can stock up on a bunch of consumables in town. You can also upgrade your whip, permanently, and what a feeling that upgrade gives. You go from the whip to a few different levels of flail, then ultimately back to a whip but with flames. It's a powerful weapon that adds this intense visual satisfaction to go along with your numerical improvements. The whip ranks second in importance among your toolset though. The exploration over combat focus here means that items that aid exploration are king. Holy water is chief among them. It hasn't changed all that much from Castlevania 1, it's still some nice range damage tied to a stun, but what has changed is the game that exists around it. The inhabitants of Simon's Quest aren't the only people playing tricks. The ground beneath your feet isn't what it seems. Trapdoors and false bottoms are everywhere, and the best way to detect them is to anoint all the floors you come across, a task made easier by the fact that holy water doesn't consume energy in this game anymore. If the water flies through, it's a fake floor. If it makes contact, your boot can safely step it. It makes navigating the 5 mansions not just a process of action and platforming, but adding a caution layer of seeing where you're even allowed to platform. What saves it from being frustrating is that these collapsing floors never open up to bottomless pits. They're usually just a demotion to a lower level. Your reward for all of that patient skulking is the ultimate treasure held in each manor, one of Dracula's body parts. The 5 pieces of the Dark Lord aren't just keys to the final boss, but tangible boons to your combat and exploration. His rib grants a shield, his eyes grant vision to secrets, and so on. Once all 5 are acquired, his lair becomes available, and what awaits you isn't a challenging final ascent through the castle, but a boldly empty one. There's not a monster in sight up to and including Dracula's room, just an atmospheric walk. Upon reaching that final room, all of Dracula's pieces can be assembled, and this final fight acts as a perfect beacon for the game's new style, especially when contrasted against the first game. Castlevania 1 Dracula was a skill check. Everything you needed dropped in the corridor between him and his checkpoint, and successfully lopping off his head came down entirely to smart positioning and well-timed jumps. Castlevania 2 Dracula is a stat check. Having a maxed out whip alone means he dies in just over a dozen hits, and the greatly expanded inventory here means there's tons of ways to cheese him. You can load up on invulnerability giving laurels and make yourself immune the whole fight, or you can spam Sacred Flame to keep him stun locked. It serves the game's themes and mechanics well. Challenge isn't to be overcome, but to be invalidated, and exploration and preparedness facilitate that. Simon's Quest's weird idiosyncrasies and internet fame have spawned lots of mod projects, and the best ones are the ones with the most delicate hand. Castlevania II English retranslation plus map is pretty good. Translation has not only been adjusted, but given more direction. Now, the first NPC you walk into still tells you to get the white crystal, but also stresses the importance that this is the way to start your adventure, and the second NPC tells you where you can find that white crystal. The shift from day to night is no longer a harsh transition with a long text box, but a smooth gradient that doesn't interrupt gameplay. That plus map might be the most interesting addition, both because it gives you your relative location, but also because it gives you an experience more like Japanese players. They had a map included in their manual that didn't make it to the US version of Simon's Quest. It's a shame that what the hack calls quality of life features are mandatory. Generous invulnerability frames and the ability to jump off stairs both make the easy platforming of Simon's Quest even easier, but also make that platforming feel a bit less like Simon. The rigidity associated with stair traversal is a signature of the NES Vanias, and attempts to smooth that out feel like they're made for an audience who would be better served by just playing Symphony again instead. Simon's Redaction has a much smaller change list, and what changes it does contain are almost entirely localized to text boxes. The translation has been cleaned up again, and this time, those trickster false hints have been removed entirely. There's no map here, but dialogue has been reworked to ape a map. Now there's someone in each town who explicitly says the name of the town that you're in, and the signs have been beefed up to make the names of neighboring towns more obvious. It's still a horrible night to have a curse, too, but this time that mandatory text box transition is down to 4 seconds from the original game's 10. Both mods are a viable substitute for the original adventure. The only wrong way to play Castlevania II is to not play it at all. My preferences lie with the original unmodded experience, not despite but because of its warts and oddities. It's a product of a transition from arcade to console, a game of the Castlevania brand before that brand calcified into a very specific type of quest. It's a game you have to meet halfway, but it rewards you for that effort. Simon's Quest is a grand little adventure, and while it can be obtuse, it definitely doesn't suck ass.